Three men were on their way home when they suddenly felt weak. They turned off their equipment and heard the most terrifying sound of their lives: a faint hiss of air. Fear gripped them because home meant Earth. While they were astronauts in space, orbiting 150 kilometers above the planet's surface. Air was leaking out of their capsule. They had lost contact with mission control, and they didn't even have spacesuits. Could the fate of these three cosmonauts really depend on a single tiny hole? Or was there more to the story? In this video, I'll tell you about one of the darkest tragedies in the early history of space exploration, the crash of Soyuz 11. Viewer discretion is advised.
Space, the final frontier.
You might not know this, but the phrase that begins this video was used to open every episode of the legendary space series Star Trek. It first aired in the late 1960s, during the peak of the space race between the USSR and the USA. Yet this isn't footage from a TV show. It's a real demonstration of the world's first space station, Salyut 1, launched by the Soviet Union in 1971. This round of the space race was a win for the Soviets. However, there was a massive but. When the station reached orbit, the hatch to the scientific module failed to open, and 6 of the 8 onboard fans broke down. This meant that the astronauts who arrived wouldn't be able to breathe properly or conduct the scientific experiments the mission was all about, at least until the fans were fixed, if they even could be. Still, the Soviets decided to take the risk and sent the first cosmonauts to Salyut 1. When the crew boarded the Soyuz 10 shuttle, everyone wished them a safe journey, but the launch was suddenly canceled. The reason was that a cable mast holding the rocket upright had malfunctioned, and because of rain, stray voltage had formed on the shuttle's surface, which could cause equipment failures, or even a fire. The next day, Soyuz 10 finally launched successfully. It reached the space station and docked. But apparently, there was a 9-centimeter gap between the sections, a hole the size of a man's palm that was practically open to space. Without spacesuits, this gap could mean instant death due to lack of oxygen. Even inside the sealed shuttle, they only had about 40 hours of air. Why? Because the Soviets were so confident in the airtightness of their spacecraft that they didn't think backup systems were necessary. The sheer number of malfunctions raised suspicions that the USSR was so desperate to win the space race that they were willing to risk their astronauts' lives. This time, the Soyuz 10 team tried to deliver people to Salyut, yet their only available option would have damaged the station's docking mechanism, making it unusable for any future missions. The command had no choice but to abort the mission and ordered the crew to return to Earth. Preparations began for a new mission, Soyuz 11, which turned into the most infamous disaster in the history of Soviet space exploration. The main crew selected for this new mission included astronauts Kubasov, Leonov, and Kolodin. Leonov was a living legend, the first human to go into space. During that historic expedition, Leonov almost lost his life because his spacesuit expanded and became too stiff for him to re-enter the shuttle. In space, there's no air and, therefore, no pressure. Spacesuits are inflated to mimic Earth's pressure so the human body can function. Leonov managed to deflate his suit enough to survive. His quick thinking made him a top candidate for the mission. But just when everything was ready for the launch of Soyuz 11, an unexpected event turned everything upside down. During a final medical check, doctors found a suspicious spot in Kubasov's lungs that could have been tuberculosis. If he was contagious, the whole crew would be at risk. The decision was made to ground the entire team. This caused a massive scandal. Kubasov was permanently disqualified from the mission, while Kolodin still had a chance to make history and wasn't ready to give up. Leonov, the mission's captain, tried to work with a new engineer, yet the two clashed repeatedly. After endless arguments, complaints, and attempts to sway decisions, the final verdict shocked everyone. The backup crew would fly instead. Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev. It was unprecedented to replace an entire crew at the last minute. Tensions ran so high that the original team didn't even shake hands with the replacements or see them off. Still, Leonov gave one critical piece of advice: manually close the valves between the orbital and descent modules. He didn't trust the automatic systems, but Soyuz 11's troubles began even before that advice became relevant. When the astronauts docked with the orbital station, they found it filled with thick smoke that made it impossible to breathe. Nobody knew if entering the station was safe. However, if they didn't, the crew would have to return home empty-handed. Again, the Soyuz 11 team took the risk. They replaced the station's filters and spent 24 hours in their shuttle, hoping the air would clear. Fortunately, it did. The mission became a triumph. Every action of the cosmonauts was reported in news broadcasts worldwide, and their live transmissions from the station captivated audiences. They were the first humans to live in space. Still, behind the scenes, things weren't as optimistic. First, the cosmonauts were physically exhausted. Life in zero gravity isn't as easy as it looks. Second, the psychological strain was immense. The pressure of responsibility and constant media attention overwhelmed the astronauts. They often snapped at each other, but stopped short of physical fights. Yet they faced a shared challenge: the vibration of the Soyuz 11. The crew had to exercise daily to prevent muscle atrophy in zero gravity, with their treadmill shaking the entire station. Outside was the deadly vacuum of space. The real catastrophe struck on the 11th day. A fire broke out at the station. Even minor damage to any critical system could mean death for the whole crew. Ground control advised an emergency return to Earth, but the crew managed to resolve the issue, extending their mission for another 11 days. It was a record-breaking success. The Soviets had achieved the longest human stay in space at the time and gathered invaluable data. But as the cosmonauts prepared to return to Earth, a warning light on Soyuz 11's control panel indicated that their hatch wasn't airtight. They couldn't detach from the station. With their limited air supply, even the smallest leak could be fatal. Still, the Soviets insisted it was a faulty sensor because they believed the spacecraft was perfectly sealed. The astronauts took the risk, manually sealed the hatch, and depressurized the cabin. The warning light turned off. It was indeed just a broken sensor. Relieved, the crew undocked from the station. By Moscow time, it was 9:25 p.m. Soyuz 11 remained in orbit for a few hours before firing its engines at 1:35 a.m. 12 minutes later, it began re-entry. The service module detached, leaving only the descent capsule with the crew. But then, communication with the capsule suddenly stopped. The command began to worry and prepared for the possibility that something could have happened to the astronauts. For the next 7 minutes, Mission Control anxiously tried to locate the capsule on radar. When they finally spotted it, their worry turned to dread. It was 2,200 kilometers off course. Helicopters were dispatched immediately. The capsule softly landed at 2:16 a.m., yet the crew never responded. When the search team found no external damage and finally opened the capsule, they were speechless. All 3 crew members were sitting in their seats, smiling, yet they were all dead. Their pale skin bore dark blue spots, with black and maroon streaks trailing from their eyes and ears. Moreover, Dobrovolsky's body was still warm. Doctors immediately attempted artificial respiration, but it was all in vain. This was all recorded on camera. Although I can't show you the footage, I'll leave a link in the description below. Thus, a great Soviet success turned into an even greater tragedy. The public judgment was immediate. Specialists rushed to find the cause, and when they did, they were shocked. The failure lay in something the Soviets were completely confident in, something Leonov had warned about: air tightness. Almost immediately after module separation, the cosmonauts felt their hearts racing. Breathing became difficult, their ears rang, and they felt dizzy. This wasn't the excitement about returning home. These were symptoms of hypoxia. The capsule's alarm had sounded a warning about depressurization. They were 150 kilometers above Earth's surface. In space, where there's a complete vacuum, they had to act instantly. The astronauts turned off the alarm and all sound-emitting devices, hoping to hear the faint hiss of air escaping. And they did. From one of the ventilation valves Leonov had warned about. There were 2 of those, one under Dobrovolsky's seat and a backup under Patsayev's. Both astronauts unstrapped and went to check the valves. One of them was open. Dobrovolsky felt the air leak and began sealing the hole. But it was too late. Within 15 seconds, a critical amount of air had escaped through the 2-centimeter opening, causing the astronauts to suffer severe hypoxia and lose consciousness. In 20 seconds, all air in the capsule was gone. The pressure plummeted, and the fluids in their bodies boiled. So, how could this happen? Was the known defect just ignored? It seems the problem went deeper than that. To separate the spacecraft modules before atmospheric re-entry, explosive bolts were supposed to fire sequentially. But for some reason, they detonated simultaneously, damaging the automatic ventilation valve. This caused it to open in space instead of 5 kilometers above Earth, where fresh air would have entered the cabin. The tragedy might have been avoided if the crew had closed the manual ventilation valves, as Leonov had suggested. Yet, that wasn't all. The valves were under the cosmonauts' seats and couldn't be reached quickly. After the cause of the tragedy was identified, Leonov personally tested how long it would take to close a valve. It took 55 seconds. Biomedical sensors attached to one of the astronauts showed his heart stopped after 40 seconds. This meant survival during depressurization wasn't even an option. The cosmonauts couldn't reach the valves, didn't have spacesuits, and the shuttle lacked an oxygen system. But none of this was disclosed in Soviet media, of course. What's more, the true cause of the Soyuz 11 crew's death wasn't revealed publicly for 2 years. First, Soviet leadership wanted to hide from its own people that the tragedy was due to their mistakes, not mere chance. Second, they wanted to alarm their main competitors, the USA, who were planning to launch their Skylab space station. While it seems the Soyuz 11 tragedy is clear-cut, it's not. Their deaths were prepared long before the mission even began. 7 years before launching the Salyut-1 station and Soyuz 11 mission, Soviet cosmonauts were on the brink of setting a world record in space. They were preparing to launch the Voskhod-1, the first 3-person spacecraft. Previous ones could send only 1 astronaut, while this one was supposed to include an engineer and a doctor. The US had already tested the Gemini spacecraft, accommodating 2 crew members. The USSR hurried to set a new record first. Without the capability to develop a new spacecraft, they modified the existing one, the 1-seater Vostok. These things were changed. An emergency rocket was added to the descent module. 1 seat was replaced with 3, and they removed the spacesuits. Spacesuits were bulky and weighed over 20 kilograms, with additional equipment weighing about the same. But after adding extra seats, there was so little space in the module that cosmonauts didn't fit, even without suits. The future crew had to go on a diet just to fit into the capsule. All this just to beat the United States. That's how the future Soyuz 11 crew ended up without spacesuits. The Soviets had no intention of developing a new capsule to accommodate them. However, the problem ran deeper. The Soyuz 11 crew could have easily perished aboard Salyut itself, given its history mirrored Voskhod and Vostok's. On April 23, 1967, the Soviets launched the Soyuz 1 spacecraft into space. It was piloted by Vladimir Komarov, a seasoned military pilot and one of the Voskhod crew members. The new mission was ambitious. A second capsule was to launch from Earth and rendezvous with Voskhod in low Earth orbit, and Komarov was to perform a spacewalk between them. That was the plan. Reality hit differently, though. The rocket successfully delivered Komarov into orbit. He circled the Earth 16 times in 24 hours and prepared for the mission's main task. But as he attempted a maneuver, one of the 2 solar panels that powered the spacecraft failed to deploy. Komarov was helpless. The second module wasn't sent, and he was ordered to return to Earth. For some reason, Komarov couldn't activate the capsule's brakes, and it fell too fast. At 7,000 meters, the parachute was supposed to deploy, but it didn't. The lines tangled as the capsule entered the atmosphere. It plummeted at an insane speed and struck the ground in a devastating explosion. When the recovery team arrived at the crash site, they were met with a horrific scene. Twisted metal surrounded by scorched earth. The spacecraft was unrecognizable. As for Komarov, this is a detailed 3D recreation of what was left of him. Komarov became the first human to perish in space. Rumors spread that Soyuz had over 200 structural issues at launch, and officials knew. Engineers and the backup pilot allegedly begged to postpone the mission, but they were ignored in the race against the US. And do you think the Soviet Union learned its lesson after such a tragedy? Of course not. They used this dangerous spacecraft, which had already claimed the astronaut's life, as the basis for the Salyut-1 orbital station. It was the same one with malfunctioning fans, smoke, and fires, from which 2 crews barely escaped alive. Worse still, they kept building other Soyuz crafts until the 11th mission ended in another deadly disaster. And for what? To claim they were first at something? Ultimately, the Soviet Russia achieved its goal. It became the first country to kill 1, then 3 people in space. And it seems nothing has really changed in that regard for this country, especially when it comes to valuing human lives.